Hosts. Hey, we are live. Hey, folks, thanks for tuning into the BAMF podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lafferty, and today we have RPG legend, Mr. Jeff Dee, with us today. How you doing, Jeff?
Hi, everyone. How you doing?
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Gracing us with their presence are several usual co-hosts, Jacob Blackman, well-known RPG artist from Oklahoma. How you doing, Jacob?
Always a pleasure.
Yep. Below Jacob in the Brady Bunch grid is Owen Casey Stevens, another RPG legend. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing well. Thank you for asking.
And last but not least, Chris showed up at the last minute as a favor to me. Christopher McLaughlin, well known for his work as Green O'Neill, currently known for his work at Ghost Show Press, where we're putting together a horror movie criticism anthology that will be released very, very soon. So welcome, Chris. Thanks for showing up.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. I can't say no to you. And moreover, you need to have better locks on your chat rooms.
Locks on my chat rooms? What?
Yeah. I'm implying I broke in.
Oh, okay. I'm with you now. All right.
Work with the man.
I'll just hide.
I apologize, everyone, in advance, but this is the little video musical intro I have to play to assure people that we're a high production value professional. So just give me 1 second. Deeply sorry about that, but it's contractual. I have to play it. So.
Nice.
Oh, thanks. So, Jeff, you've been in RPGs just about longer than anyone I know. I mean, you've been in the business one way or another since the old TSR days when you were drawing some of the original art.
I'm not one of the absolute earliest original ones, but I'm like, the first wave that came after them. Right? So, yeah.
Yeah, kind of long storied career. Besides working on Dungeons and Dragons, you were involved with West End Games, Star Wars.
Yeah.
And one of the OG superhero RPGs, Villains and Vigilantes, and its current incarnation, Mighty Protectors, from your company, Monkey House Games. So,
all true.
It's what kind of perspective do you have on the industry? I mean, you've been doing it now since the 70s. Looking back on it, what kind of thoughts and feelings do you have?
I am continually astonished that the entire hobby of role-playing games is like 50 years old. Throughout all of human history, either nobody ever thought of let's take, each player will be a person and we'll have rules for figuring out what happens when those people try to do things, right? And that'll be a game. Either nobody ever thought of that or it never caught on until, 50 years ago. That is amazing to me because it seems like such an obvious thing to try. And so I love this hobby dearly. I grew up on it. When I started at TSR, I was 18 years old, right? Role-playing games have been my entire life since nearly adulthood. And I just love them to bits. So, I've been designing RPGs now for 47 years. And I dare to pretend that I have some things to say about them, and the subject which is dear to my heart, trying to get a handle on what it is we are doing and what is the best way to do it, and is there such a thing as a better set of rules and a less good set of rules, or is it all what people seem to assume, at least in the general public, that whatever you like is the good set of rules, and it really has nothing to do with any kind of objective standards, with any kind of understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish when we play these games, right? But what it's all about. So that's the kind of thing I'm hoping to babble at you about today.
All right. That is very interesting. Well, do you have thoughts on the whole? Are we going for genre emulation versus reality, simulation? Or is it like you say, something you look to the guys at the table, whatever feels good for them?
So I have gotten myself into trouble, and I acknowledge that this was a mistake on my part. Trying to argue for a while that role-playing games are the kind of thing that original D&D players were doing, right? Not the mechanics part, but just the activity part and the general structure of that. Versus your people who do story gaming and so on. And I've realized that is a mistake. That is not going to be the way to do it. Instead, I thought, okay, well, there's people who have a clear idea of how their games work. They call themselves story gamers. I need a clear idea of the kinds of games that I'm interested, that I want to do a good job developing. And so these days, I just talk about that part of it, which I'm calling tabletop immersive simulation games. An immersive simulation game is a term from the computer game industry. Actually, there's a great Wikipedia page on this. Did any of you ever play the old game Thief?
Oh yeah,
on the computer.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Thief is regarded as one of the earliest immersive simulation computer games, where the approach is, instead of everything being canned and everything having to happen a certain way, instead they modeled an environment and basic rules of how things interact, and then the player is released into that to solve the problems of the scenarios. However they can, however they figure out how to do it. So that and in fact, the designers in the computer game industry that came up with that approach specifically cited tabletop role-playing games as their inspiration, right? And that's a really hard kind of thing to do in a computer game, because lacking a game master, they're still going to be limited to whatever it is they have hard coded. It's just a different approach, right? General rules for the way things interact, rather than specific rules for every single possible situation. And if it's not there, you can't do it, right? So I want to steal that back and say that's the kind of gaming that we're talking about when we say there's the kind of role-playing games that are players each have a character, the characters have abilities, the players are in situations, and they are trying to get through those situations using the abilities that they have. In contrast to story games, where there's a story going on and the players have influence over the story, and it's about making the story go a certain way, come out a certain way, that is a fundamentally different approach. Nothing wrong with it, but that's not what I do. And here, as soon as you start talking about, well, maybe there are having established standards for what it is you're trying to do with a set of role-playing game rules, I'm immediately in danger of getting yelled at for criticizing Gygax and Arneson for some things that they did in their mechanics, and I don't see it that way. I think that if you're a modern day automotive engineer, you can be amazed at what Ford accomplished with his Model T, while still thinking that is really not the best way to do it, right? It's just amazing that they got that far, and that's where I'm coming from. So please.
Would you say that
questions?
Would you say that say Villains and Vigilantes and original D&D and like space opera and that whole first generation of games, do you think they all fall in that definition of something different from story game? Do you see all of those as being from that first generation of the kind of game you're talking about?
I think in any game where the general model is each player is a character with abilities, and the way that they interact with their environment is through the use of their abilities, and players, trying things. I think that's the model I'm talking about. Now that can either have a game master, or that the game master's role can be replaced with alternatives. Like I'm a big fan of this thing called Mythic. You guys familiar with Mythic? It's that relatively small press thing with it replaces. Sorry, yes.
Oh, I heard about it last year. I had an adventure I published for Icons, and someone told me that he would use Mythic as a GM to run it as a solo adventure, and I'd never heard of it before. I was like, "Wow, what is this wizardry? You must tell me of this."
The basic idea with Mythic is that 95% of what happens at the game table is players asking the game master questions, and Mythic just takes the process of answering those questions and automates it. Right. And what the players do is their input is, well, how likely does the answer seem to be yes versus how likely it seems to be no? And that's a normal thing for players in an RPG to think, right? So you send that to the engine and then roll dice and you find out what it really is. That's the basic idea. It's very clever. There's pitfalls, right? There's issues with it. There's rough edges. Sometimes you can go down a rabbit hole of like weirder and weirder and weirder implications of the answers because you happen to roll oddly several times in a row, right? But for example, I was doing a solo. I don't even think I had a system. I was just testing out Mythic, right? It was a solo game where I was an asteroid miner, and I was just going to tool around the asteroids and dig stuff up, right? And I wound up encountering this big spaceship that was getting in my way, and all of my answers came out odd, and I was driven to the conclusion that this was an ancient artifact that was lying around, that had been abandoned, that had been designed for certain purposes, because it was all that was left that made any kind of sense, right? So that's neat, right? That you can get things that are surprising and cool without making them up yourself directly. So anyway, yeah, I think the tabletop immersive simulation game model is anything where each player is a character and their role in the game is to make decisions for their character and use their character's abilities, whether there's a GM or not, and however the resolution is done. I don't care if you use cards or dice or poker chips or that is a separate question, right, of how now to come up with mechanics to get the players in a game like that through the events of the game and get acceptable results. Now, there's a famous quote attributed to Gary Gygax that I have a lot of trouble with, that I'll paraphrase for a moment. The secret we must never tell the game masters is that they don't need any rules, right? That's a famous quote attributed to him. I have a lot of issues with this. Like, one, if you're told this by Gary Gygax, right, if you're the person who heard this and he said it was the secret you should never tell people, what are you doing telling people, right? That just immediately makes me suspicious of the motives of the person passing on this quote. But second of all, it's clearly not quite true. There's a philosopher, Daniel Dennett. I'm slightly slipping into the atheism thing here, but I won't bring religion into it. Philosopher Daniel Dennett has a term he likes to use that I think it's his daughter coined it, called a deepity. It's a thing. A deepity is a thing that sounds really profound but isn't, right? It's because on a boring, simple level, it's true, but on a meaningful level, it isn't, and it gets people all excited. And I think this Gygax quote is like that, because people, in fact, want rules. There are cases of folks sitting down around a table, but I'm a huge Empire of the Petal Throne fan. I think you guys know. Professor M.A.R. Barker wrote Empire of the Petal Throne. and then he wrote Swords and Glory, and then he wrote Gardasil, like 3 different sets of rules for his setting. But by all reports from the people who actually gamed with him, he never cracked open a rule book. He had a pair of percent dice, and players would describe what they were doing, and he would think, how likely is that, right? And roll his percent dice and just decide. But that's rules. That is a form of rules. Now, I think that the real kind of deep secret about role-playing game rule design is that, oh, thank you, that's cool. Anything that can answer those questions from the players to the GM, any process, pulling chips out of a cup, rolling dice, flipping coins, consulting your horoscope, anything that will answer the questions will resolve that issue, so then events can advance to the next thing. So to me, role-playing game design is about coming up with the best, and there are multiple standards by which this can be judged, the best procedures for answering those questions. And when the standards I'm talking about are, do the results feel valid, right? Like it shouldn't be, well, every time I reach into my pocket to see if I have my car keys, we flip a coin, and half the time I don't. That won't feel right, right? So there's that validity. There's fun. Will the results be like kind of exciting? Are they going to be? That's largely about being random enough that there are surprises. Are they playable? Because you can drill down. I mean, we kind of passed through this phase from ages ago where your chivalries and sorceries went into vast amounts of rules for everything and drilled down to incredible deep levels of detail, but are hard to play. And things like that, right? Those are the considerations to address. And so please ask more questions.
Are you familiar with the role-playing game Dread that is played with essentially a Jenga tower?
I have seen Dread. I've seen like a video. That's all I know.
Okay. So there are 2 role-playing games that were real eye-openers for me in terms of design. And one was the Amber Diceless role-playing game, because it has rules, but there is no randomizer in it. You simply, everything is rated, and you and the other players try and convince the GM what rating is used here, and whoever has the highest wins. So there's no randomization. And the other was Dread, because with Dread you've got a Jenga tower, and as the game proceeds, if the tower collapses, everyone loses, and every time you try stuff, you have to pull a number of blocks. And that means that not only is there a single pass-fail mechanic for everything, and arguably not random. I think human beings are shaky enough in air currents that we can call it random, but it's a very different kind of random. But also in Dread, you know that the more we're doing stuff, the closer we're getting to that state where everything is going to collapse, and we have to be increasingly careful, and the stakes are automatically raised through the mechanics. So I find those both very interesting when I'm trying to apply your specific tabletop immersive simulation idea, because in Amber, for example, you are very specifically playing one character with one set of abilities. It's set in a world where one of your abilities is to move from reality to reality to reality to change the nature of the reality around you, which can sort of impact what your abilities are. But of course, that's based on the Amber books, so that's drawing from that IP.
Right.
So how do you consider randomness to be an important part of what you see as part of what makes a tabletop immersive simulation? Do you think that people are playing, for example, Amber or Dread?
So my feeling is, if you're making a game where, I'll use the word immersion, though I've gotten pushback from some people about exactly what that means. What I mean by it is giving the player the sense of being the character and being there.
Yeah.
And real people in real situations do not know how things are going, and are surprised and can't necessarily see that coming. And I think that, randomness is a fine way of preserving that and making it have that level of immersion, as long as it's tuned well, right? So, I'm hesitant to directly criticize other people's game designs.
Sure.
Right? But I will say neither of those games that you just cited, in my opinion, neither of those approaches does the best job of directly addressing what I think people are after, players are after, in specifically the kind of game that I want to design. Doesn't say anything bad about them as the kinds of games they are, right?
Absolutely.
You know
I mean, there's analysis
there's
is not
different
necessarily the
approaches.
same as critique.
See, like
right.
the Jenga tower thing seems much more like a story-oriented mechanic, because it's imposing that impending doom, which it only needs to be there if the story demands that it be there. And there's, it seems to me, all kinds of situations characters could get into, where it's not about impending doom, but it is about, let's clear this hurdle and move on to the next thing, right? So for that specific purpose, sounds like it does its right thing for its kind of game.
Well,
but it's not where I would go. See,
maybe
I'm coming from. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, maybe that's where you're getting into genre emulation versus more reality simulation. And I want to take a second to acknowledge that Walter Billiard has entered the chat. Hey, Walt.
Hi, Walt.
Hi, Jeff. Hey, guys.
I'm glad that you brought up genre simulation. So I think a large part of the reason where I've wound up where I am in my views of role-playing game mechanics is having my first game be a superhero RPG. Because the thing about superhero RPGs is they have to be able to do everything. I think it's no surprise that Champions came out as a superhero RPG and then became, a generic system. That's natural, and that is essentially where we've gone with Mighty Protectors, is done the work on its mechanics that would enable it to handle a much wider range of things. But as a guy coming out of superhero games where it's every genre at once, that's not a real high criteria in my mind for a good set of mechanics. Again, if you have a game that needs a very specific kind of feeling, then something like Dread is a reasonable way to go there. But if you're just trying to have players sitting around a table with characters with abilities who are encountering situations and then trying to use their abilities to deal with them, you don't need that, right? Then I think that the necessity of mood in that is on the GM, if you got one, to engineer the situations that they run into to have that growing sense of dread. That's how I would do it.
So I'm just curious what kind of games you feel are appropriate to the game style emulation you're trying to portray here. Obviously, you cited a couple of systems, but is there anything specific that you would like to point towards that you feel best emulates what you're trying to get across?
I'm not going to, and I'm not even going to point to my own, because I consider this something I'm still trying to do a good job at, right? And I've done systems rules that violate these things, right? A cave master is not a really good version of the kind of generally good game system that I am in favor of. But it had a genre need, which was to make the mechanic something the cavemen could have done, and that doesn't give me a lot of room to play. I would rather talk about philosophy and not like pick apart other people's games, and certainly not put my own games on a pedestal, but rather talk about more philosophical, low level design things.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, because there's a bit of what you were saying about Gygax. You don't need rules, except you kind of do, because otherwise, what does the strength score mean? How much does that lift? And if you don't have rules, what's to stop me from saying, okay, that we're blocked by a chasm, I just fly across the chasem. How do you fly? It's like,
right. I think it's completely understandable for there to be a pushback in the hobby against rules becoming a monolith of complexity that is hard to deal with, right? And a natural reaction to that is to say, screw all this. Anything that resolves this question and lets us move forward is going to work on a certain level, right? But for gosh sakes, let's move away from big, complicated sets of rules like original AD&D, right? With its 3 rule books, for the Dungeon Master's Guide, full of just a grab bag of weird special case rules for things. So one of the things that I think a good immersive simulation game does is have more general rules that are applicable to a wide range of situations. So you learn the rule once, and then you can go back to it when you need. And I will dip into my latest game, Mighty Protectors, for an example. There is a table in Mighty Protectors where, depending on the number of points of damage that your character has caused to some inanimate object, right, here's the size of the hole that they make. And that is applicable for a guy fell down from space onto some asphalt and boom, he made a crater. That's the hole. It's applicable to the guy with a disintegration beam shooting at a brick wall. Here's the size of the hole he made, right? There's a guy punching his way out of a prison cell. Here's the size of the hole he made. You're trying to break into somebody's vehicle while it's in motion and, get inside. You smash on it until you make a hole that's big enough you can get through. It is one mechanic that does a lot of things, and that's just an example of a thing that I think is good in immersive simulation game design.
Oh, cool. Do you want to touch on your latest release at all? I got the cover here.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned Mighty Protectors. So we went through a big legal battle to get our publishing rights back. So Jack. Oh, we're talking War Heroes. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
This just came out this month. So
it did, and it's way late, and it's all my fault. This was written by Brian Adams. He ran the playtest campaign for Mighty Protectors. The campaign ran for 5 years. And at the end, we said, Brian, why don't you take all of the extensive notes that you've written up, all the characters you've come up with, your timeline, your vehicle stats, and all this stuff, and we'll put it together in a book. He also ran a second campaign, which was more Sergeant Rock or, Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos kind of thing, where we were human scale guys, and that was a great test of the low power stuff you can now do with Mighty Protectors that wasn't really possible with V&V. It's great. It's huge. It's gigantic. It's everything that you would need to run a World War II era game.
Yeah, 260 pages. That's a hefty tome. Did you tweak the rules at all for that Golden Age feel, or are we going just for like we're talking about, just more?
No,
Okay.
There's not now. There are some additional like abilities and ability modifiers and things in the game, but that's more expansion than change. Like Brian had some issues with the way our vehicle system worked when you talk about more primitive things from the 30s and 40s, and so he came up with some additional modifiers, but the core mechanics are the same.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's just out now on looks like June 16th, so just a week.
I always like seeing a superhero game that can handle normal people well, because it's pretty rare when that happens. The last game I really played that was Hero System with Champions. I've tried it a couple of times with Mutants and Masterminds, but doesn't really work.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the original V&V wasn't like that particularly, right? I mean, a fight between two normal people would be a bunch of miss, tap, miss. There was just nothing they could accomplish. It was silly.
I gotta tell you, the last fight I was in was much like that, though.
Okay, fair enough. If you make characters who aren't any good at it, that could certainly be the case. Or who are really good at it at dodging. So, and there's been huge evolution in my game design sensibilities since 1982 when revised V&V came out. A lot of the stuff that made it into Mighty Protectors are things that first were developed for some of my other games in between, and we just ported them over. Which is, I sort of have a like universal structure in mind for how a simulation RPG needs to work optimally. And now when I design any set of rules, I'm designing for that structure, right? So there's your check to see if the thing you were trying to do connects at all, which would be like a skill check or a roll to hit. And then there's the question of whether what you accomplished is enough to affect the target, and if so, how much, which would be, if it's combat, that's damage versus protection, and how hard it is to knock that guy out depends on what they can absorb. Or if it's a skill, and I haven't actually gone here yet, but if I do another design, there will be like a skill roll and also the amount of work that needs to be done to do the task. And okay, I succeeded, but I've only gotten this much of it done, right? That to me is like a core of what you need to know if you're going to do a simulation. Now, there are a lot of games out there, particularly the D&D model, where in the core mechanics, your roll to hit is the armor affects your roll to hit, where I would put it on the resisting damage end. So and that leads to what I call the poison dart problem, where you hit a guy in plate armor with your poison dart, and because you hit, it automatically got through and delivered its poison. And that's not how I would do things. And this is getting back to another issue that I want to bring up, which is, yes, you have people sitting around a table, they have brains and imaginations, they can make all this stuff up. But I think the fundamental reason why people want some rules is they don't want to have to make everything up. And on the other end, that's sort of like the game master's burden. But as the players, you also want to feel like the kinds of results you're going to get are reliable and based on some kind of standards and not just GM whim. Because if it's just whim, then you never know if you have a chance. And if there are mechanics, then you can have a sense of your chance of success. So, and the trick is always fulfilling that need for mechanics without bogging the whole thing down so that it's hard to play. So on the specifically with the poison dart thing, right? The reason I think the right way to do it is separate chance to hit from damage and, accuracy and dodging versus force of the attack and ability to absorb that force, is because then you resolve the situation and okay, this is what happened. I hit the guy in the plate armor with my blowgun dart and it went ting off his armor. You just know that. Nobody has to make it up. And the cost of getting that extra piece of information is extremely tiny. So I think that's worth going there. But again, like in my Cave Master game, I don't make that distinction, right? Because it's cavemen with handfuls of rocks.
I love Cave Master, by the way. When you came on to demo that for us a few years back, that's still one of my favorite episodes of the last few years. And I wanted to call out that Leonard Pimentel is the designer for Prowlers and Paragons. He's been chiming in our comments. I appreciate that, Leonard. Thanks for coming out. And I've just got a few minutes left before I have to go do dad stuff. But we talk about
I used up your whole show already. I can babble. Just before I came on, I was sent a transcript by another guy who I did an interview with. And oh my God, did I babble? So I'll stop now. Go.
It's okay. We talk creative process sometimes, and do you, especially when you're doing game design, do you have a certain ritual you use to get in that kind of headspace, or is it more it just comes easily to you? Do you have a process for that?
So, given the sort of general universal underlying structure that I think is good for simulation RPGs, when I start coming up with mechanics, I do first start with like a clever die mechanic, maybe, right? I'm not partial to D20s, but we use them in Mighty Protectors because it's grandfathered in from older versions of V&V. If I thought that our fans would accept it, I'd have gone to 2D10s because I think it's just better and more stable. But anyway, so then I have in mind, here is a thing that needs to be resolved. How would I use the mechanic I have in mind to address that? I'll chart it out. I'll open up Excel and look at, if I handle it this way, what kind of results am I going to get? Does that feel right? If it doesn't, how do I tweak it, without completely breaking the mechanic and as simply as possible to address it in a way that does feel right? And then I'll test, what if I have a much more powerful person trying to push open this door, right? When I run that through the mechanic, does that produce the results I need? There's a much weaker person. Will they be able to succeed? How often? And does that feel right? So I test it up and down the line. Of course, my choice of what things to even have rules for is gonna be driven to some extent by the needs of the genre of the game. Like, I'm not gonna have spaceship rules in a fantasy game, probably, but I'm not looking for. I'm looking for mechanics that, if I then take this same system for this fantasy game I'm building and take it to space, right? I know I'm gonna need to add spaceship rules, but does all this other stuff still kind of make some sense? That's how I design things.
Since Owen recently did the design work on Starfinder, which has both fantasy and science fiction, I wish he was here, but he was having some lag problems. So thanks for coming out, Warren. Sorry you had to tap out. Walt, you were a big Jeff Dee fanboy, and we actually scheduled this at your request. So before we have to tap out, I wanted to give you a chance to step up to the mic and ask any questions or express any thoughts, comments, or whatever you might have on your mind.
Just a big question. I was always huge fan of your art. You did the
I said we could do art. We didn't really do it. Go.
It's all good. Sorry, Balder's chiming in from the other room. When in regards to using art to inform the narrative that the games that you're creating, how do you choose the art that goes into when you're trying to make these types of games? How do you choose the art to kind of reflect the rules so that it gives a grander, almost understanding, so that instead of looking at these huge mountains of text, you have you have something that kind of gives an example of what you're trying to convey.
Is that what you think I've been doing? Because you're gonna hate this. I pretty much don't do that. People are astonished to hear that as a designer who is also an artist, I actually think of art as a necessity, but not what the game is about. And so I am more interested in just prettying up the book than I am in the art conveying any particular things about the way the game is going to play. Now, that being said, when I'm doing my design, I'm designing for, a system that will be exciting and fun and interesting. So, and when I do art, I'm trying to draw exciting and fun and interesting. So it may incidentally go there, but it's not a conscious thing. I'll add that as an artist who is also a game designer, I've sort of been talking in very technical terms about game mechanics, but it all does come down to feel. When I go through a technical process and I'm going to be coming up with technical rules, but how I judge whether the rules are coming out right is, do they feel right? And when I draw a picture, I'm trying to convey a feeling in the image. And when I design game mechanics, I'm trying to come up with mechanics that will carry a certain feeling when they're played. Not as specific as the Jenga tower thing, right? Because that's not how I look at it. I'm much more focused on moment by moment results than overall mood. I leave that to GMs in my view of it.
Right on. I was just more pointing out, I always thought it would be weird when you would get a guy who was punching in a layout, and here you have rules about something you might have in Mighty Protectors, where you have a table that shows you the size of an impact on the environment, and then the picture that's put in that space is a guy trying to select which spoon to eat his Cheerios with.
You're right. There are a couple of examples of that, but really more often I have a bunch of art that has been made that I have available to illustrate this book. Pick the pieces that work the best in those places, right? But like in revised V&V, there is a picture of like a couple of big heads with like one guy reacting to the other guy, and it's by the reaction table. That was a piece of art that was done to fill that space. That's how we used to do it at TSR when I was in the art department there. I mean, when an adventure came to the art department, it was a bunch of columns of text already laid out with empty spaces, and our instruction was, see those empty spaces, read the surrounding text, find something interesting that can go in there, and then draw a piece of art that will fit, right? Fit both the dimensions of the space and the surrounding text. And there wasn't always anything interesting happening on that page or on the facing page, which is why you sometimes get drawings of empty rooms.
That's awesome.
I thought you guys just like drawing rooms. Okay, that's good to know.
No. Forced by necessity.
Yeah. I have just been alerted that I need to go do dad stuff. All
right.
So, Jeff,
I'm willing to hang around. If you guys want to chat some more offline, I'm willing to hang around after you stop the recording. Can you do that? Or is that not
Yeah,
allowed?
No, it'll keep going when even if he leaves it. It'll keep bouncing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
I can hang around. I can hang
the room
for
sticks
15
around.
minutes.
Yeah,
I'm all
like
fired up now.
yeah, like if you leave early, and the other guys on the podcast talk about firing you off the podcast. You get involved.
I'm really sorry that happened, Chris. I can't tell you how much.
Oh, it's not your fault. It's
You guys
we
are
all.
hilarious.
All right, I do have to go take the boy to a place. So,
All right,
Jeff, always a pleasure
thanks
talking
so
to
much.
you. Chris,
Thank
Jacob,
you,
thanks
Mike.
for coming out and helping us co-host, and I'll catch you guys later.